Hartford, Connecticut has a history that goes back to the 1630s, but no buildings survive from the first century and a half or so of that history. The oldest surviving house in the city is the Butler McCook House on Main Street, pictured here, which was built in 1782. But if we were to jump back over 100 years ago to the late 1800s, there were a few houses built before the Revolutionary War that were still standing at that time on Main Street. In this video, I'm going to talk about 3 of these colonial houses, all of which were torn down by 1914. By the way, you can also read about these houses in my book Vanished Downtown Hartford, which is available from the History Press and online retailers like Amazon. So who lived in these homes and when were they torn down? Here's a plan of Main Street, Hartford, showing the buildings and occupants at the period of the Revolution, which was published in John Warner Barber's Connecticut Historical Collections in 1837. The 3 houses I'm going to talk about all appear on this plan, and they were all still standing in 1898, but they were all gone by 1914. First, I'll talk about the Joseph Whiting House, which was built in the mid-1600s. It was owned by Aaron Bull at the time of the Revolution. Then I'll move on to the Governor Joseph Talcott House, built circa 1725. At the time of the Revolution, it was owned by Governor Talcott's son, Colonel Samuel Talcott. I'll end with the house that Colonel Talcott himself built in 1770. It was the last of the 3 to be built, but the first to be demolished in 1898. After I talk about the 3 houses, I have an extra story that I'll share. It involves a cockfight and a carriage chase, so think of it as a little extra Easter egg at the end of the video. This is the northeast corner of Main Street and Charter Oak Boulevard, diagonally across the street from the South Congregational Church. The Joseph Whiting House stood on this corner. Let's go back to a view of the same area over 200 years ago. This image from William DeLoss Love's book, The Colonial History of Hartford, published in 1914, reproduces a painting done in the 1810s or 20s. On the right is the corner of the South Congregational Church. That is not today's church building, erected in the 1820s, but an earlier one built in 1754. The 1824 plan of the city of Hartford shows how the church, here referred to as the Second Presbyterian Church, was unusually situated out near the middle of the road at the intersection of Main, Buckingham, and Charter Oak. Just across Main Street was the Whiting House. It was named for Joseph Whiting, who lived from 1645 to 1717. He served as treasurer of the colony of Connecticut from 1679 until his death. In 1682, he purchased this property. He may have built the house himself at that time, or it might have been even older, dating to the period when Francis Barnard owned the land between 1650 and 1667. The Whiting House is documented in Norman M. Isham and Albert F. Brown's book, Early Connecticut Houses, published in 1900. They provide a floor plan. The house actually faced towards what's now Charter Oak Avenue to the south, with the gable end along Main Street. It was a classic saltbox-type house with a lean-to at the rear. Later owners would close up the original front door so that the main entrance became a door on the Main Street side. As I mentioned, by the time of the Revolution, the house was owned by Aaron Bull, a sea captain and shoemaker who died in 1793. In 1788, Aaron sold the land next door to Amos Bull, who built a brick gambrel-roofed townhouse. Unlike the Whiting House, which no longer exists, the Bull House survives, but it was moved twice in the 20th century. First, it was moved eastwards to make way for a parking lot. Then it was saved from demolition and moved to its current location on Prospect Street, behind the Butler McCook House garden, where it is now used by Connecticut Landmarks. As for the Whiting House, it had changed considerably by the start of the 20th century, having served for decades as a saloon. The picture on the right shows that the house still had its distinctive saltbox shape, but the front yard at the corner of Charter Oak Boulevard had been filled in with another saloon. High-resolution old photos like this allow us to zoom in on some of the details. The main part of the Whiting House had a saloon, but the north section had Dodge and Brewer's meat and fish market and grocery store. According to a story published in the Hartford Courant on March 9, 1898, quote, "Used a screwdriver. John Doty, a 15-years-old boy, was arraigned last night for stabbing a clerk employed in Dodge and Brewer's market at 100 Main Street. According to the story of Doty and his mother, Doty was in his yard early yesterday afternoon, and a boy named Buck threw a snowball at the grocery clerk. The latter thought that Doty hit him, and he caught him by the throat. Then Doty took a screwdriver out of his pocket and struck his assailant in the shoulder, drawing blood." Unquote. The Whiting House and the neighboring building were torn down in 1914 to make way for a new 6-story structure on the site. But the two saloons managed to stay in business in a most peculiar way throughout this construction process. As the Courant reported on May 24, 1914, quote, "The proprietors of the two saloons on the east corner of Main Street and Charter Oak Avenue are qualified to write a treatise on how to conduct the saloon business under difficulties. Within the past few days, they have seen workmen engaged in George B. Schwartz's preliminary plans for the erection of new buildings on his property at the corner tear away the buildings until nothing but the mere shells of the saloons have been left. The roof of the saloon of Ignaz J. Paradina at number 336 Main Street, the second saloon from the corner, has been torn off so that it is practically shelterless. The corner saloon, the old Hawksworth place, has fared nearly as bad and is partly roofless. But in spite of the chaos and despoiling of the property, business was going on at the same old stand, and men could last night quench their thirst at the bar and at the same time gaze up into the star-flecked sky. The saloon air dome has never been popular, and there is a reason for the conditions which exist at the corner of Main Street and Charter Oak Avenue. The liquor men hold unexpired licenses, and the law is so rigid that if their buildings were torn down and they temporarily suspended business, the licenses might be considered dead, in which event it would be necessary to apply for licenses as new applicants. And while a church within 200 feet does not prevent the renewal of a license, no new license could be granted at the locations in question on account of the proximity of the South Congregational Church, which, being within the distance limit under the present law, would effectually block the granting of such licenses. Accordingly, the saloon men are wise men and are holding the fort and their licenses at the same time. Therefore, the new buildings will go up and will be built up over the saloons. The business will go on. Last night was a pleasant night, and there was no indication on the part of the frequenters of the two places that they objected to the fact that the inhabitants of Mars were spotting them. The two saloons are old landmarks of the city. It takes very old inhabitants to recall when the thirsty multitudes first began to resort here and swap their yarns over the grog. But no one can recall an occasion before in their history when they could recline against the bar and stargaze at the same time." Unquote. Having described saloon air domes in May of 1914, The Current reported on June 7th, quote, "Today, however, Mr. Hawksworth's place cannot even be dignified by the name of Air Dome. Carpenters constructed a building within a building for him, and a few days ago the outer shell was removed, leaving a piano box sort of structure where business is now being carried on. Mr. Hawksworth's building is so small that a tiny sign in the window almost shuts out the daylight. Frequenters of the place have to stand in a row in front of the bar, and there is no room for any tangoing. If one in the line before the bar relaxes and forgets to stand erect, the place immediately becomes crowded for the others. Usually a beer keg or two stand outside the door so that there may be more room on the inside," unquote. So the two saloons continued in existence in the new building that had been built around them. That building itself was eventually torn down and replaced in 1969. Nestled in a little crook formed by the G. Fox building on Main Street at the corner of Talcott Street is a one-story commercial building. On that corner once stood a house built about 1725 by Joseph Talcott, who was governor of Connecticut from 1724 to 1741. Reverend Joseph Stewart later owned the house from about 1800 until his death in 1822. Starting in 1808, he kept in the house his Museum of Curiosities that he'd started in the old State House and which is recreated there today. After his death, his widow moved the museum to the corner of Main Street and Central Row. As for the Talcott House, by the end of the 19th century, it had been used for years as retail stores on the ground floor with tenements above. The house was also a source of consternation for the city of Hartford for many years. The problem went back to when the original owner, Joseph Talcott, had deeded a right-of-way through his land so that the city could lay out Talcott Street, which extends eastwards from Main Street. The difficulty was, as is shown in this old atlas, that the house, including a rear addition, encroached on Talcott Street. For over a century, city officials who wanted to properly lay out the street would wrangle with the property owners. At one point, the city even removed a section of the house at ground level to allow for a sidewalk, although the upper floors still projected above this tunnel out over the street. By the end of the 19th century, many were longing for the chance to simply demolish the building. A crisis finally came in 1899 when the owner of the property leased it to a dry goods store that wanted to make substantial repairs, adding a modern plate glass window to the front and constructing a new addition to the rear. The city attorney was horrified as he feared any attempt to prolong the existence of this building with new materials might void the city's claims to the land. An injunction was issued, and the case nearly went to the state Supreme Court before an agreement was reached whereby the recently deceased owner's heirs were paid $400 and the building was finally demolished in 1900. Here's a higher resolution image of the house and the addition along Talcott Street shortly before its destruction. This is the area that overhung the sidewalk that I mentioned. There were various advertisements along the side. A girl sitting next door, and a display for a clock and watch store. Also some advertisements that are still familiar today. This picture shows the view east down Talcott Street after the old Talcott House was torn down. Our last house was located just north of where the Stilts building stands today on Main Street. This house was built in 1770 by Colonel Samuel Talcott, who was the son of Governor Joseph Talcott. An illustration of the stairway in the house appears in the book The Memorial History of Hartford County, Volume 1, published in 1886. Just like the Governor Talcott House, the Colonel Talcott House by the end of the 19th century had also been converted to commercial uses. This house was torn down about 2 years before the Talcott House across the street. One contemporary lamented its destruction in an article entitled An Old Mansion, which appeared in the Current on May 27, 1898. The house, he wrote, quote, is being ruthlessly torn down by workmen who have neither a thought for its own history nor for that of those who lived there over a century ago. Tomorrow it will have existence only in a pile of timbers, and in a few months even they will be cleared away, and a row of one-story stores will occupy the place." Unquote. The work of demolishing this historic structure brought to light a number of lost relics. The author of that article writes about an old hammer, probably used in building the house, that was found, as well as an inkstand bearing the mark June 18, 1772. Discovered in the rafters was a wooden cane with a steel dagger concealed in the handle. The reporters speculated that a silver plate bearing the inscription MT must have belonged to Colonel Matthew Talcott, Samuel's brother, who resided in Middletown. There was an old saying that whenever Colonel Matthew Talcott went from Middletown to Hartford, as he crossed the little bridge, he made all Hartford tremble because he held so many mortgages there. In 1775, Matthew Talcott was a member of the committee appointed to provide for the prisoners of war sent to Hartford from Fort Ticonderoga. The reporter noted that the relics were currently in the keeping of George M. Goodell, who ran the shoe store next to the Talcott House. So as I mentioned, this Talcott House was torn down in 1898. I want to thank you all for watching this long, and as I mentioned at the start of this video, I have a little extra story to share with you. This story actually relates to Mr. Goodell, who owned the store next to the Talcott House. So this story is kind of interesting, or maybe it isn't. That's for you to judge. It's a bit of what they call a shaggy dog story, but it gives us a little vignette of Hartford over 120 years ago. According to the Hartford Current, April 19, 1901, quote, Deputy Jailer Michael D. Connors and Deputy Sheriff Thomas F. Egan had a lively ride Wednesday night after cockfighters. A few days ago, it was reported to Sheriff Smith that Moses Greenbaum, who conducts a drugstore on Albany Avenue, and George M. Goodell, who has a shoe store on Main Street, had arranged a cockfight Wednesday night, and that they were to meet on Albany Avenue opposite the home of B.L. McGurk at 8 o'clock that night to decide where the fight was to be pulled off and go from there to the place. Deputies Connors and Egan were selected by Sheriff Smith to stop the fight. The officers were out on Albany Avenue before 8 o'clock and waited at the spot where the cockfighters had decided to meet. They hitched their team some distance from the place, and shortly after they got there, Mr. Goodell came up and stopped his team. A little later, a two-seated team came in sight, and on seeing Mr. Goodell in the roadway, the driver of the team stopped, and the occupants had a short conversation with Mr. Goodell and drove off. Mr. Goodell was about to follow when he saw Mr. Egan and Mr. Connors walking up the road. Goodell said, "Hello, Mike," and Mr. Connors said, "Hello, George." Goodell told Mr. Connors that he had heard that he was going to be out there to stop the fight, and he said the fight was not to take place as it had been declared off. Mr. Connors said he proposed to stop the fight if he could, and he told Mr. Goodell that if the party succeeded in giving him and Mr. Egan the slip, it would be found out where the fight was pulled off, and the people would be prosecuted. Goodell told Mr. Connors that he could take his word for it that there was to be no fight, but he said he had to be at the place where the fight was supposed to be in order to save his forfeit. He started to drive off, and Mr. Connors and Mr. Egan started in pursuit. Goodell went out Albany Avenue, and finally turned to the left, and by a circuitous route brought up on Farmington Avenue and drove west, with the deputies close behind. At Vanderbilt Hill, Mr. Goodell slackened speed, and Mr. Connors drove up alongside. Goodell again assured Mr. Connors that the fight was off. He did not want to have the officers think he was giving them a long ride, but the only thing he wanted was to get to the place about on time to save the forfeit. He told the officers that he had a pretty good team and that he could lose them if he wanted to. He started his horse at a good rate of speed, which he kept increasing. As the two teams were about a half a mile this side of West Hartford Center, it became evident to Mr. Connors that his horse was no match for Mr. Goodell's, and that he was fast being distanced. When they got to West Hartford Center, the Goodell team was out of sight. There was no one in sight at West Hartford Center to give the officers a tip as to the direction Mr. Goodell took, and they continued west. They went about a mile and a half, and as there was no sign of the Goodell team, they turned around and came back to West Hartford Center, and then drove north. Some distance north of the center, they saw a light in a barn. The team was stopped, and the officers went to the barn, but there was no sign of cockfighters. They continued north, and finally saw two men walking in the direction in which they were driving. They asked the men if they had seen a team going north. The men answered negatively, and Mr. Connors said to Mr. Egan, "I guess we have lost them." One of the men overheard this statement, and not knowing Mr. Connors and Mr. Egan, he said, "You fellows must be looking for the same thing we are. We are looking for the cockfight." Mr. Connors said, "We are looking for the fight too, but I guess we got the wrong tip." The man answered back, "They told us it was going to be at the bungalow, but they don't seem to be there." The officers started for the bungalow, but there was no sign of life there, and they came to the conclusion that they had lost the fight and returned to the city. The belief is that the fight was not pulled off. The story as to how the fight was arranged is a bit interesting. Mr. Goodell had a talk with Mr. Greenbaum some time ago. Greenbaum said he could get a rooster that could lick Goodell's and offered to bet $50 he could, according to a man who claims to know. Goodell offered to bet him $5 that he dare not put up $50 that he could. Greenbaum took the $5 and later put up the $50 and won the $5 bet. Greenbaum did not have a rooster of his own, and he set out to find one, and made some inquiries regarding roosters. Eddie Dolan and a fellow named Battelle heard that Greenbaum wanted a rooster. According to the story, they went to him and told him that they knew of a rooster in Willimantic that had never been beaten, and that they could get it. Greenbaum directed them to do so, and he went to tell some of his friends. He was told that perhaps a job was being put up on him. Dolan and Battelle told Greenbaum that they were going out to Willimantic on a certain day to get the rooster. Greenbaum was advised to accompany them, and on the day before they were to go, they notified Greenbaum, it is said, that the Willimantic man had come to the city and had brought the rooster with him. Mr. Greenbaum, it is said, got enthusiastic, and quite a bit of money was put up on the fight. It was finally learned that the rooster which was to be put up against Mr. Goodell's was of the dunghill variety, and that it had been obtained in Parkville. There had been much talk about the proposed fight, and someone squealed, and the fight did not come off. Some of the parties whose names are mentioned were making inquiries yesterday about the sheriff and Mr. Egan and Mr. Connors." Unquote. As a footnote to that story, the Current reported on April 23, 1908, that George M. Goodell, who conducted a shoe store in the city, has filed a petition for bankruptcy. He owed over $10,000, and, quote, Goodell makes oath that he is not possessed of $30 to pay the filing fee, unquote. Thanks for watching.